Something has been consistent across every major civilization that has ever encountered swans. Not the same story, not the same symbol, not the same interpretation. Different cultures, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, with no contact with each other, no shared mythology, no common origin for their beliefs about this specific bird, arrived at the same conclusion independently. The swan is not ordinary. The Greeks placed it in Apollo's service and gave it the gift of prophecy. The Norse put it at the edge of the world, guarding the well where fate itself was stored. The Hindus made it the vehicle of Brahma, the creator, and gave it the name Hamsa, a word that in Sanskrit carries associations with the breath of the universe. The Celts surrounded it with prohibitions so severe that killing a swan was, in some traditions, a transgression that could not be undone. The Siberians built their clan identities around it and treated its image as a direct channel to the ancestor world. Coincidence is not a satisfying explanation for this pattern. When independent cultures separated by geography, language, and cosmology all arrive at the same category for the same animal, the most honest response is to ask what they were seeing. What is it about this bird specifically that kept producing the same category across civilizations that shared almost nothing else? That question has an answer. And the answer is not mystical. It is behavioral, biological, and in some ways more interesting than the mythology it produced. But the warning in the title is real. And by the end of this video, you will understand why the civilizations that built the most elaborate relationships with swans, that studied them most carefully, that integrated them most deeply into their understanding of the world, treated them not as beautiful objects, but as something you approach with care, something that sees you back. Number 1. What the Greeks actually believed, and why Apollo chose a swan and not an eagle. The association between swans and Apollo is one of the most specific and durable in classical mythology, and most people who know it have never asked the question that makes it interesting. Apollo was the god of light, of reason, of music, of prophecy, of the sun. His primary animal was the swan, not the eagle which went to Zeus, not the owl which went to Athena, the swan. Why? The answer that classical scholars have reconstructed from the sources is not primarily aesthetic. It was not because swans are beautiful and Apollo was associated with beauty, though that association existed. It was because of something the Greeks observed about swans directly that mapped onto Apollo's specific domain. Swans sing before they die. This is the origin of the phrase swan song, which has entered modern usage as a metaphor for a final performance, stripped almost entirely of its original meaning. The Greeks meant something more specific and more unsettling. They believed that swans, which are largely silent through their lives, produce their most beautiful vocalization in the moments before death, not as distress, as something closer to ecstasy, as if the swan, at the threshold between life and whatever comes after it, had access to something that was unavailable to it during ordinary existence. Socrates invoked this belief in the Phaedo, the dialogue in which he prepares to die by drinking hemlock. His companions are weeping. He tells them that the swan sings at death not from grief, but from joy, because as Apollo's bird it knows what awaits on the other side of death, and what it knows is good. The swan's death song is a prophecy. The swan sings because it can see what humans cannot. The ornithological reality of swan song has been examined by researchers. Mute swans do produce a distinctive sound in certain conditions that is not part of their normal behavioral repertoire. The sound made by air passing through the trachea of a dying or severely injured bird, combined with the resonating chamber of the long neck, can produce a haunting musical quality that observers have described consistently across centuries and cultures. Whether this constitutes what the Greeks meant is a question that depends on what the Greeks meant, but the observation was not fabricated. There was something real at the foundation of the belief. What the Greeks were doing, in placing the swan in Apollo's service and giving it prophetic capacity, was categorizing an animal that presented consistent evidence of perceptual capabilities beyond the ordinary. An animal that seemed to know things, that responded to the approach of humans in ways that suggested awareness of intent rather than just proximity. That paired for life in a way that looked, to human observers, like a chosen relationship rather than a biological program. That appeared at threshold moments, dawn and dusk, migration times, the edges of the seasons, with a regularity that made it feel like a marker of transitions. They made it a God's animal because they did not have another category for what it was doing. Number 2. The Norse saw something different, and what they saw was darker. In Norse cosmology, swans occupy a position that has nothing to do with beauty or music. They are placed at the world's edge. At Urdarbrunner, the well of fate at the base of Yggdrasil, the world tree, 2 swans swim. They are white. They are always there. They are, in some interpretations of the prose Edda, the source of the whiteness of all swans that have existed since. The Norns, the 3 beings who weave the fate of gods and humans at that same well, are attended by swans, or are associated with swan transformation in several source texts. The swan maidens of Norse mythology, women capable of becoming swans by putting on feathered cloaks, are not romantic figures in the Norse context. They are entities connected to the Valkyries, to the choosing of the slain, to the processing of death and its aftermath. The Norse were a culture that took fate seriously in a way that most modern readers find difficult to fully enter. Fate, in the Norse worldview, was not a background condition. It was an active force, woven and decided by specific entities at a specific location. The placement of swans at that location is not decorative. It is a statement about what swans are associated with, at the level of cosmology. What the Norse were observing that produced this cosmological placement was probably several things simultaneously. The swan's longevity, its apparent permanence at specific locations across human generations, made it feel like something outside ordinary time. A swan that a great-grandfather knew at a lake might still be there, might even be the same bird when the grandson came to that lake. In a culture without the biological knowledge to understand lifespan and population dynamics, this looked like something close to immortality. Like an entity that existed at a different relationship to time than the humans who came and went around it. The behavior at boundaries, the consistent appearance of swans at dawn, at dusk, at the edges of frozen and unfrozen seasons, at the transitions between states, reinforced the sense of a creature that existed at thresholds. That was somehow native to the in-between, the moment of change, rather than to any stable condition. The Norse did not make swans beautiful symbols. They made them fate-adjacent. They placed them where the most serious business of existence was conducted. That is a different kind of attention, and it reflects a different kind of observation. Number 3. What India understood that Europe missed completely. The Hamsa of Hindu and Buddhist tradition is sometimes translated as swan, sometimes as goose. The ornithological precision matters less than what the Hamsa represents, and what it represents is one of the most sophisticated uses of a bird as a philosophical concept in any cultural tradition. The Hamsa is the vehicle of Brahma, the creator. In this role, it carries the being responsible for the existence of everything on its back, which is a significant statement about what kind of animal the tradition considered it to be. Vehicles in Hindu iconography are not arbitrary. They are chosen because their qualities reflect or complement the qualities of the deity they carry. The Hamsa carries the creator because the Hamsa, in Hindu thought, embodies a specific capacity that creation requires: discrimination, the ability to distinguish between the real and the unreal. There is a story, repeated across multiple Sanskrit texts, of the Hamsa's unique capacity to separate milk from water when the two are mixed, pure milk on one side, water on the other. The Hamsa drinks only the milk and leaves the water, perceiving the difference that is invisible to other beings. This capacity for discrimination, for separating essence from dilution, for seeing through mixture to what is real, is the quality the tradition chose to associate with the swan above all others. In the context of the philosophical tradition, this is embedded in the discrimination between milk and water, is the discrimination between Atman and Maya, between the self and the illusion, between what is real and what only appears to be. The Hamsa sees through appearances. The Hamsa perceives the nature of things beneath their surface presentation. The Hamsa also carries the breath of the universe. The Sanskrit mantra Soham, which translates roughly as I am that, is said to be contained in every human breath. The inhalation carries the sound. So, the exhalation carries ham. Together, they form the name Hamsa. Every breath you take, in this tradition, is an invocation of the swan. The bird is built into the rhythm of existence at the level of respiration. What India was articulating, through this philosophical framework, was an observation about perception. The swan sees differently. It perceives something that other animals and most humans miss. The cultural elaboration around this observation reached a level of philosophical sophistication that the Greek and Norse traditions did not approach. But the underlying observation was the same. This bird is doing something with its perception that other birds are not doing. Something that produces behavior, responses to the environment, interactions with the humans in its world, that suggests an inner life more complex than the surface presence. Number 4. What the Celts feared, and why the prohibition on killing swans was among the most serious in the tradition. Celtic relationships with swans are documented across Irish, Welsh, Scottish, and Breton mythological material, and the consistent thread running through all of it is not reverence in the sense of admiration. It is reverence in the older sense of the word. Fear of violation. Awareness of consequence. In Irish mythology, swans are almost always transformed humans, specific humans with names and histories and families and grievances. The Children of Lear, perhaps the most famous swan story in the Irish tradition, involves 4 children transformed into swans by a jealous stepmother, condemned to 900 years on specific bodies of water, retaining human consciousness and human voices throughout. They can speak. They can sing. They remember who they are and who they were. They are recognizably people, trapped in the form of a bird, moving through a world that has no framework for what they are. The consequence of this cosmological premise is profound for how the culture treats actual swans. If swans might be transformed humans, then killing a swan is potentially killing a person. Not metaphorically. Actually. The prohibition against harming swans in Celtic tradition was not a conservation measure or an aesthetic preference. It was a response to genuine uncertainty about what kind of being you might be harming. This uncertainty, this inability to be sure what the swan in front of you actually is the warning that runs through the Celtic tradition more consistently than any other. You cannot know. The surface does not tell you. The bird that looks like a swan might be a king's daughter. The bird that looks like a swan might be your ancestor. The bird that looks like a swan might carry the memory of a wrong that was done to it before your grandfather was born, and that has not yet been resolved. The cultural logic is compelling even stripped of its supernatural premise. Treat the swan carefully, because you do not fully know what it is. Approach it with the awareness that there is more to it than the surface presents. Do not assume that the limitations of your perception define the limits of its inner life. That is not a bad principle for engaging with any animal whose cognitive and perceptual capacities you do not fully understand, which is, as it happens, most of them. Number 5. The Siberian clans and the oldest relationship on record. The Swan cult of Siberia and Central Asia is the oldest documented human-swan relationship, and it is the least known in the Western tradition. Among several indigenous Siberian peoples, including groups in the Ob River Basin and the Lake Baikal region, the swan was not a symbol or a mythology. It was an ancestor. Clan identities were built around the swan as a founding figure. Origin stories describe the first human mothers of specific lineages as swan women who had chosen to become human, to take on human form and remain in the human world. Their swan nature did not disappear when they became human. It persisted in their descendants. The people of the Swan clan were, in their own understanding, part swan. The bird on the lake was a relative. The behavioral implications of this cosmology were specific and practical. Swans were not hunted by those who held them as clan ancestors. They were not eaten. They were protected, not through legal prohibition, but through the deeper prohibition of harming kin. A hunter who encountered a swan and recognized the clan marking in its behavior, the specific qualities that identified it as a member of the ancestral lineage, was encountering someone he was related to. Researchers studying these traditions in the 19th and 20th centuries, before the Soviet suppression of indigenous religious practices largely ended them, documented specific behavioral observations that the clan members used to identify swan individuals as ancestral presences. These were not supernatural claims in the way Western observers initially interpreted them. They were observations. The swan that appeared at specific locations at specific times. The swan that behaved in ways that distinguished it from ordinary birds. The swan that seemed to recognize specific humans in ways that were not explicable by food association. These observations, made by people who had been watching swans in specific locations for generations, who carried accumulated knowledge about individual birds and their behaviors across decades and centuries of close attention, were more detailed and more ecologically sophisticated than most Western ornithological observation of the same period. The cosmological framework that organized the observations was different from a scientific one. The observations themselves were not. What the Siberian traditions were recording, in the language available to them, was individual recognition, long-term memory, behavioral complexity, and the specific quality of sustained attention that a swan directs at humans. It is classified as significant. They interpreted this through the lens of ancestry and kinship. The interpretation is culturally specific. The underlying phenomenon it was responding to is not. Number 6. The warning. What all of it adds up to. Here is the thing that connects Apollo's prophetic swan to the Norse fate weavers, to the Hindu discrimination capacity, to the Celtic uncertainty, to the Siberian ancestry. Every civilization that looked carefully at swans, that sustained attention on them over generations, arrived at a version of the same conclusion. This animal is paying more attention to you than you are paying to it. It sees more of you than you see of it. It knows things about the humans in its world that those humans do not know about themselves. The warning in those traditions was not mystical. It was practical. It was the warning that comes from careful, sustained intergenerational observation of an animal with individual recognition, long-term memory, high perceptual acuity, stable territorial presence across human lifetimes, and a behavioral complexity that does not exhaust itself on first or second or 100th observation. The warning was, do not be casual with this animal. Do not assume that the limits of your perception are the limits of its awareness. Do not treat it as a decorative feature of the landscape. It is watching you. It has been watching you. The record it is keeping about you is more accurate and more detailed than the record you are keeping about it. Every civilization built a different story around this observation, but the observation underneath the stories was the same, and the observation was correct. We know this now not from mythology, but from field research. Individual recognition confirmed. Long-term memory confirmed. Behavioral assessment of specific humans confirmed. Differential response to familiar versus unfamiliar individuals confirmed. Responses that reflect accumulated behavioral history rather than immediate stimulus confirmed. The ancient civilizations did not have the vocabulary or the methodology we have now. What they had was time, sustained, multi-generational attention to a specific animal in specific places. And out of that attention they extracted, through whatever interpretive frameworks were available to them, the same core truth that modern research has since confirmed in controlled conditions. The swan is not what it appears to be on the surface. The surface is white and still and moving across the water with a quality of grace that has made it a symbol for 3,000 years. But underneath that surface is something that has been watching human beings for as long as human beings have been watching it. Something that remembers, something that assesses, something that distinguishes between the human who can be trusted and the human who cannot, between the person who is safe to allow close and the person who is not, between the individual it has known for years and the stranger who just arrived. The ancient civilizations that built the most careful relationships with swans treated that capacity with respect. Some treated it with fear. Some treated it with reverence. Some built entire cosmologies around it. None of them were wrong to take it seriously. The question is whether you do. Tell me in the comments, which civilization's relationship with swans surprised you most? And has learning the history behind the symbolism changed how you think about the bird on the lake? I want to know what this opened up for you. I read every one.